Mara's mom is family. Well, it's different. That was the first thing Arlen said to me that Mother's Day morning before I'd even sat down. No Happy Mother's Day, no smile, just those words dropped like a stone into the room. I stood there for a moment, holding my tea, letting the heat seep into my palms while the cold in his voice settled in my chest. The dining table was already set. Bright flowers, polished silverware, a small gift bag in the center. Mara slid into her chair, her eyes flicking between me and Arlen. She didn't correct him. "That's for your mom," Arlen said, pushing the bag toward her. She reached in her face, lighting up. "Oh, Arlen, an iPhone 16 Pro Max. She's going to love it." I lowered myself into my seat, keeping my expression neutral. The smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air, but it didn't reach me. "That's generous," I said quietly. Mara passed the plate of rolls to Arlen first, then served herself. I waited until it reached me last, tearing off a small piece. 2 years they had been temporarily staying in my house. 2 years of their shoes by the door, their coats on the banister, their unopened mail stacked on the sideboard. And now, in my own dining room, I was being told I wasn't family. I looked around, my gaze lingering on the corners of the room I had painted myself, the garden I had planted with my own hands. My name was still on the deed, but somehow I had been reduced to a tolerated occupant in the home I built. I took a slow sip of tea. "Well," I murmured, "I hope she enjoys it." The conversation moved on to their upcoming trip, to how Mara's family would be joining them for dinner next week. I stayed silent, watching their smiles, their easy laughter. By the time my plate was empty, I already knew what I needed to do, and it wouldn't require raising my voice. That night, when the house had gone still, I shut my bedroom door and slid the fireproof box from the back of my closet. The latch clicked open, and the familiar weight of my past settled in my lap. Property deed tax receipts, a folder labeled in my handwriting, trust agreement. A year ago, before Arlen and Mara moved in for a few months, I'd had Hendry, my longtime friend and lawyer, help me restructure things. The main house remained mine outright. The in-law suite they occupied, connected by a single locked door, was listed separately, legally recognized as a rentable unit under my sole control. They didn't know that detail. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal on the trust document. In neat legal language, it granted me the right to set terms, collect rent, and enforce late penalties. Backdated no less to cover the past year. I picked up the phone and called Hendry. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm. "Haven't heard from you in a while, Varela. Everything all right?" "They told me I'm not part of the family," I said plainly. A pause. Then a low whistle. "So it's time. It's time," I confirmed. "I want the paperwork delivered first thing Monday. Rental agreement back. Rent house rules, everything we discussed." He chuckled, not unkindly. "They'll hate you for it." "I'm aware," I said, closing the box and sliding it back into its place. "But they've made it clear how they see me. I'm just matching the definition." We went over the details: monthly rent calculated at fair market value, 12 months of arrears payable in installments, late fees outlined in bold. It wasn't vindictive. It was business. And business was something I understood better than either of them. When I hung up, the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I sat for a while, letting the silence wrap around me. By the time I turned off the light, I'd already decided where I would be sitting when they opened that envelope. Monday morning, I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock. The mail carrier handed me a large manila envelope that needed my signature. I thanked him, set it on the counter, and made myself a fresh cup of tea before carrying it into the dining room. Arlen and Mara were halfway through breakfast. Without a word, I placed the envelope in the center of the table and sat down across from them. "What's this?" Arlen asked, already reaching for it. "Open it," I said, stirring my tea. He tore the seal, pulled out the neatly clipped stack of papers, and began reading. His brow furrowed almost immediately. Mara leaned in, scanning over his shoulder. "This is a lease agreement," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Yes," I replied, calm. Arlen flipped through the pages. Back rent. 12 months. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said evenly. "According to county records, the suite you've been occupying is a separate rental unit. You've enjoyed it rent-free for over a year. That changes today." Mara gave a short, incredulous laugh. "We're family. You can't treat us like tenants." I met her eyes. "Last week you and Arlen made it clear I'm not part of the family. I'm simply taking your words at face value." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clink of Arlen setting the papers down. "The terms are fair," I continued. "Market rate for the area with a payment plan for the arrears. Utilities will be billed separately. Late fees are outlined in Section 4. Mara pushed back from the table, muttering something under her breath. Arlen stayed seated, eyes fixed on the paperwork, as if it might rearrange itself into something less offensive. "You'll need to sign and return it by the end of the day," I said. Finishing my tea, I stood, rinsed my cup, and walked out of the room, leaving them with the envelope and the sound of their own breathing. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and listened to the muffled voices rising below. By late afternoon, the envelope was back on the kitchen counter signed. Arlen's signature was tight and slanted. Mara's looked more like a scratch across the page. They hadn't spoken to me directly since morning. The next day, I noticed small changes. The kitchen, once a constant hub of their noise and clutter, was suddenly quiet when I entered. They began eating most of their meals in the suite. Doors closed more often. Footsteps moved softer. On the third day, Mara slammed the connecting door after I reminded her that utilities were now metered separately and billed to their unit. A minute later, Arlen appeared, trying for a calm tone. "Mara's just stressed. This is a lot to take in." I nodded. "Adjustments usually are." He rubbed the back of his neck. "We honestly can't afford this. Not with the trip we've planned." My eyes flicked to the glossy travel brochures sitting in a neat stack on their side of the counter. Trips are a choice. Rent is an obligation. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just turned and walked back to their suite. That evening, I unplugged the shared Wi-Fi router in the hall closet and set up a separate connection for the main house. Their network equipment left in the suite would require their own account. The following morning, I locked the pantry cabinet in the kitchen, leaving them space in a lower cupboard for their own groceries. These weren't punishments. They were boundaries, clear, simple, enforceable. By the end of the week, they spoke to me only when necessary. When we did share a room, the air felt dense, as if every word had to push its way through unspoken resentment. I kept my responses brief, my tone even. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I was looking for order. And slowly, I could feel it returning, one small change at a time. It was on a quiet Sunday morning, over the sound of the coffee maker, that I realized the real shift had already begun, not in the house, but in the balance of control between us. The end of the month arrived without a rent payment. I waited until the grace period expired before sliding a printed notice under their door, polite, firm, with the late fee clearly stated. 2 hours later, Mara stormed into the kitchen, waving the paper like it was an insult in itself. "This is ridiculous. We're family. You can't fine us like strangers." I didn't look up from slicing vegetables. "It's in the lease you both signed. The same lease that grants you use of the suite." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "Family doesn't treat each other this way." I met her eyes. "Family also doesn't tell each other they aren't part of the family." Her mouth opened, then closed. She spun on her heel and left the connecting door, slamming hard enough to rattle a picture frame. An hour later, Arlen appeared. His tone measured, but his shoulders tense. "Look, this is just a rough patch. Things have been tight, and the timing, I set the knife down. You've been living here rent-free for over 2 years, Arlen. The timing is long overdue, he sighed, leaning against the counter. We could do some work around the house instead. Maintenance yard work. I shook my head. That's not payment. That's upkeep. You should have been helping with all along. He didn't argue further. Instead, he left quietly the same way he'd come in. That evening, Hendry called to confirm he'd received a copy of the signed lease and late notice per my request. You're covered, Varela. If they don't pay, you can proceed with formal action. Good, I said. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I'm prepared if it does. I hung up and returned to the kitchen. The counters were clear, the sink empty. Small details that felt oddly satisfying. I knew the silence upstairs wasn't peace, but it was space, and space was the first step toward regaining the home I'd built. The next morning, I woke to find the notice still where I'd left it on their kitchen counter, the envelope for payment conspicuously absent. By midweek, their payment still hadn't come through. I took the next step without hesitation. The separate utility meters I'd had installed months earlier were finally activated, and I placed the first bill higher than I knew they expected inside an envelope marked for their suite. That afternoon, Mara appeared in the doorway, holding the envelope. What's this supposed to be? Your utilities for the month, I said, not looking up from the book in my lap. Her eyebrows shot up. You've been tracking our usage. Since the day you moved in, I replied evenly. Now you're paying for it as outlined in the lease. She huffed, muttering about petty rules, and stalked back through the connecting door. The following day, I updated the household rules on the shared calendar we all had access to. Laundry room use was now by sign-up sheet, 30-minute grace period, after which the load would be removed, and a $25 fee applied for overtime. I posted a laminated copy on the laundry room wall and another on their door. 2 days later, I found the dryer lint trap full after Mara's load. I photographed it, filled out a maintenance violation slip, and deducted $25 from their security deposit. When Arlen came to protest, I pointed to the clause in the lease with his signature beneath it. Come on, Mom, it's just lint, he said, his voice teetering between frustration and pleading. It's a violation, I said simply, and handed him the slip. From then on, I noticed small signs of resistance lights left on in the laundry room dishes stacked in the sink when they knew it was their turn to clean. But each infraction met the same quiet, documented response fees. Added notices served nothing outside the bounds of the agreement. They could call it petty if they wanted. I called it structure. By the end of that week, the suite door was closed almost all the time. They'd begun retreating into their own space, the laughter and background noise that once spilled into my evenings replaced by a wary, deliberate quiet. The second month's rent came in late again, short by nearly $100. I placed the payment back into an envelope with a note, full amount required, partial payments not accepted. It was on their kitchen counter before they woke. That morning, Arlen cornered me in the hallway. We're trying, Mom. You're making it impossible for us to get ahead. I kept my voice even. You've had 2 years of getting ahead. This is called catching up. His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue further. Later that day, I noticed the trash bin in the garage overflowing with cardboard from recent online orders, expensive sneakers, electronics, a brand new coffee machine still in its box. The smell of entitlement was stronger than the garbage itself. That evening, I adjusted the thermostat in the main house and changed the code on the smart lock to the laundry room. When Mara discovered she couldn't get in, she knocked on my door sharply. What's going on? She demanded. You've exceeded your monthly utility allowance, I told her, holding up the printout from the meter. Access will be restored when the bill is paid. She stared at me, incredulous. You're punishing us for living here. No, I said. I'm managing my property and enforcing our agreement. You're free to make other arrangements if you don't like the terms. Her eyes flickered a mix of anger and calculation before she turned away. That night, I heard muffled voices through the wall, low, tense, and urgent. Something about finding a way out and not letting her control everything. I wrote the phrases down in my notebook just as I'd been doing since the day the lease began. Every detail mattered now. Every conversation, every late payment, every violation documented, not for petty satisfaction, but because I knew where this was headed, and I intended to be ready. By the time I turned off the light, the sound of their whispered planning had stopped, replaced by the quiet hum of the suite's air unit as they stayed behind their closed door. The third month began with no rent payment at all. No envelope on the counter, no note, no acknowledgement. I gave it 3 days before taping a notice to pay or vacate to their suite door. By noon, Mara had ripped it down and shoved it under my door with a scrawled message. "We're not going anywhere." That evening, Arlen showed up in the kitchen, his face tight. "You can't just kick us out," he said, holding the notice like it was evidence against me. "I can and I will, if the lease terms aren't met," I replied, calmly rinsing a mug. "This isn't personal, it's legal. It's always personal with you," he shot back. "Ever since Mara moved in, you've been looking for ways to push us out." I set the mug down. "You moved yourselves in. I offered time, not permanence." He stood there, chest rising and falling, but didn't say more. When he left, the sound of the suite door slamming echoed down the hall. The next morning, I called Hendry and explained the situation. "They're 3 months behind now," I said. "I'm ready to move forward." "I'll file the eviction notice," he said. "You'll have a court date within 2 weeks." While waiting for the paperwork, I began preparing the property, photographing the suite's condition, locking the storage room, and removing the spare key from its hook. I emptied the garage space they'd been using and moved my car back in. Every action felt like reclaiming a piece of my home. That night, I heard them moving furniture in the suite, loud enough to rattle the wall between us. It didn't sound like packing. It sounded like fortifying. I didn't respond, didn't knock, didn't confront them. Instead, I finished my tea, closed my notebook of records, and placed it on top of the growing stack of legal documents on my desk. When I went to bed, the notice from Hendry sat in my inbox, ready to print in the morning. The next morning, I printed the eviction notice and placed it in an envelope with their names on it. Hendry had arranged for a process server, but I wanted to see their reaction when it became official. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The process server, a tall man in a crisp shirt, stepped inside just far enough to hand me the documents for signature. Then, without ceremony, he knocked on the suite door. Mara answered, her expression already guarded. "Yes." He held out the papers. "You've been served. Court date is on the first page." She took them with a stiff hand, her eyes darting past him to where I stood in the hallway. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising. "You're dragging your own son into court." I didn't answer. The process server left his work done. Arlen appeared moments later, reading over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is how it's going to be," he said, finally looking straight at me. "This is how it has to be," I replied, my tone steady. "You've ignored every chance to resolve this." They retreated into the suite, the door slamming shut. Minutes later, I heard raised voices through the wall, Mara accusing Arlen of not taking it seriously. Sooner, Arlen blaming her for pushing me too far. By afternoon, their laughter was gone, replaced by the sound of hurried phone calls and muffled pacing. I went about my day tending the garden and answering emails, letting the tension simmer where it belonged, on their side of the door. That evening, I slid a copy of the court notice under the door, along with a typed list of the payments and violations I would present as evidence. Everything was factual, documented, and backed by their signatures. When I went upstairs for the night, the suite was silent. The papers I'd delivered were gone, but the air in the house felt heavier, as if even the walls understood that the final step was already in motion. The court date came quickly. I arrived early, documents neatly organized in a folder, every receipt, late notice, and photograph in order. Arlen and Mara came in together, their expressions a mix of defiance and unease. They had no attorney, just a manila envelope that looked far too thin to hold anything of weight. When the judge called our case, I spoke clearly, presenting each piece of evidence in sequence. The lease, the utility bills, the violation notices, every detail was backed by their signatures or dated photographs. Arlen tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Mara's defense was scattered complaints about petty rules and family loyalty that had no bearing in the eyes of the law. The judge listened politely, then turned back to my paperwork. In less than 20 minutes, the decision was made. They were ordered to vacate within 14 days, all arrears payable in full, and damages to be assessed after inspection. I didn't smile. I simply nodded, gathered my folder, and walked out. Back at the house, the suite door stayed shut for the rest of the day. Over the next week, I heard the quiet rhythm of packing boxes being taped, furniture dragged, bags zipped. There were no more confrontations, just the sound of their presence slowly dismantling. On the 14th day, I stood in the driveway as they loaded the last box into Arlen's car. He avoided my eyes. Mara didn't try. She stared at me, tight-lipped, before getting in on the passenger side. The car pulled away without a word. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The house was silent. No footsteps overhead, no television murmuring through the wall, no tension hanging in the air. I walked through each room, my hand brushing the familiar banister, the kitchen counter, the windowsill where the afternoon light pooled. In the living room, I opened the curtains wide. The house felt larger, lighter, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. That evening I made tea and sat by the window, the keys to the suite resting in my palm, the weight of my home finally my own again.